like to thank the organizers, Verena Meyer, Philipp Chomla, and Joey Rauschenberger for inviting me to this wonderful conference. I'm a little jet lagged. I got here yesterday afternoon from the American Midwest. I hope it won't make me too just to put my research into context, I will be talking today about biracial children of the first Rhineland occupation who were forcefully sterilized in the Third Reich. This is part of a book project that looks at German debates over so-called farbige Besatzungskinder after both world wars, because Germany was lost 2 world wars, as we all know, and was twice occupied by armies that also included some colonial French troops, and after World War II, African-American GIs. And so in the 1920s and again in the 1950s, we have debates over these farbige Besatzungskinder. These debates, in some ways, are markedly different. In the Weimar Republic, the children are vilified. There's a propaganda campaign against the Black Horror on the Rhine, die schwarze Schmach am Rhein, where the children are depicted as carriers of disease and carriers of racial pollution. And in the 1950s, the dominant discourse, and especially the government-supported official discourse, is one of racial integration. The children need to be integrated into German society, partly to project an image of West Germany, that West Germany is no longer a Nazi society, partly to show the world Germany can actually build democracy and racial tolerance. There is still racism directed against the children, but it takes different forms, and it is not open, and it is also perhaps not as hurtful as it was in the 1920s, where it's unmitigated, and the children are then in 1937 forcefully sterilized. And I'm looking at these debates. The bigger question is how German notions of race and Germanness change or not change in the course of the early and mid 20th century. And this is how I came across the generation, the 1920s generation of biracial children. They were vilified as the Rheinland-Bastarde, and Bastard is in all languages a term for out-of-wedlock child. The Nazis also include, and the Nazism and also meant mixed race descent, so a kind of dual stigma. Now, the first discussions or the first proposals to sterilize these children are actually made in the late 1920s. And Rainer Pommerin's path-breaking book from 1979 mentions this debate, but Germany doesn't have a sterilization law. There's a draft of a Prussian draft of a sterilization law, which the Nazis then used a lot of which the Nazis then incorporate into the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased progeny. With an important difference, because the Weimar era draft envisioned voluntary sterilization, and the Nazi law, of course, makes possible compulsory sterilization based on certain diagnoses. Now, the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased progeny does not include race among its diagnoses that justify forced sterilization. So this law is, on the surface at least, supposed to be a eugenic law, but not a law directed against explicitly people who are being sterilized for reasons of race alone. And so there's a discussion for several years among Nazi officials, leading health officials, foreign office people. So what do we do with the biracial Rhenish children? We want them neutralized, but we don't have a legal basis for sterilization, and there are competing plans. One plan is, and the Foreign Office favors this, and also Arthur Good, the Nazi public health czar, and one of the fathers of the sterilization law, they favor forcefully exiling the children rather than sterilizing them when there's no law that covers that. Whereas leading Nazi physicians, including Walter Gross, Rassenpolitischen Amt, I think is the office's name. They want secret sterilizations for various reasons. I could go into this, but I don't have enough time, but in the discussion, we might get back to that. So the biracial Rhenish children are sterilized in secret, most of them, but not all of them, during the summer of 1937. This is a big sterilization campaign that's organized under the kind of auspices of the Gestapo. The children are, of course, identified with the help of local officials, local teachers, physicians, school officials who help identify the children, youth welfare officials. And before they're sterilized, they're being examined by Eugen Fischer, Wolfgang Abel, and other people from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology in Berlin to make sure that they're really German occupation children and not perhaps descendants of foreign fathers who have foreign citizenship, because there's a concern if they're not German citizens, we may have diplomatic and international repercussions that we don't want to deal with at the moment. A certain number of children, this is important that they're not covered, that they're not sterilized under the law for under the sterilization law, because that in theory should have made it easier for them to obtain reparations after the war. There is an unknown number, however, who are sterilized under the guise of the sterilization law, because Nazi racial scientists like Wolfgang Abel, who does a study that's published in 1937 of Wiesbaden biracial children, they argue that the descendants of Moroccan soldiers are all allegedly less intelligent, more criminally inclined. And so this gives some officials, Nazi officials, the idea, well, maybe there is a group, if we look carefully, who can be sterilized under the sterilization law, which does include the category of feeble-mindedness, moral feeble-mindedness, which is used, for instance, also as a pretext to sterilize prostitutes and other non-conformist forms of social and sexual behavior. So we don't know how many biracial children may have been sterilized also under the guise of legality of the 1933 sterilization law. Total numbers are thus a little hard to pin down. Anywhere, I would think, between 450 up to 600 or more biracial children are sterilized, not just in the summer of 37, but also before and after. Now, to the best of my knowledge, thus far, we actually don't know much about this group, their biographies, and their post-war struggles over reparation. It is actually quite striking. Rainer Pommerin's book, Sterilisierung der Rheinland-Bastarde, appeared in 1979. In terms of fresh archival research on this group of people, there's still relatively little. There's more and more, and often coming out of local studies. But as a kind of composite, in terms of getting a sense of the group as a whole, I think we still have lots of work to do. And one of the problems is that the research is very hard, because to find them, one needs to have their names, one needs to have their birth dates. But with archival privacy laws, actually obtaining that information is very difficult. So it's kind of can be an exercise in futility, because one needs to have the names to get more information, but the names are often being, hard to get. And even if one has identified the individuals, then the offices that are now in charge of restitution files can still turn down an application to actually look at these files, which has happened to me in a number of cases. How much time do I have at this point? My watch is a little off.
10.5 minutes.
Okay, good. Then I need to move fast. No, because I just did the context now, which people do need to know. So I have over 200 names and birth dates and birthplaces that I have identified. And I have about 21 today. The applications for reparations that I'll be talking about concern 21 individuals. So roughly 10% of all the people I know about. And there are actually others where I know they filed for reparations, but where I'm still waiting to get my hands on those files. The group I'll be talking about, the gender ratio is 8 women, 13 men. The oldest was born in 1920. The youngest was born in 1929. Age at the time of forced sterilization was between 8 and 17. Most of the applicants applied for different types of damages to body and health, but also damages to professional training and economic advancement, Ausbildung und ökonomisches wirtschaftliches Fortkommen, compensation for imprisonment, Haftentschädigung. A number of them were imprisoned in youth concentration camps. One of them was in Hadamar for a while. Others were in other correctional institutions. Social class, overwhelmingly, they were working class, poor. Several of the men were unemployed at the time of their application for reparations. Most lack the equivalent of high school diploma. And I have no indication that any of those whose files I reviewed had attended college. Of the 21, 8 received some form of monetary compensation. Another woman underwent refertilization surgery right after the war, including post-operative therapeutic treatment, eine Moorkur in Bayern, all of which was covered by her local Betreuungsstelle für Opfer des Faschismus. The success of the surgery is uncertain, but historians have shown that the chances of success were very minimal. Another man also underwent refertilization surgery, and he reported in a letter to Bundespräsident Theodor Heuss that the surgery had been successful and that his wife was 6 months pregnant. And one question I have for people who know more about this is what other types of benefits and material support did people get who were recognized as Opfer des Faschismus oder Opfer des Nationalsozialismus, apart from monetary or medical treatment? Because in one case of a man who didn't get much money, he was protected against dismissal. So there are some legal benefits to being recognized as a victim of Nazism, apart from restitution payments or pensions. And I would be interested how significant were benefits or other things that people who were officially recognized could claim, or legal protections. I want to talk about some. When I was reading these, I was trying to look for patterns. And I saw some patterns, or at least patterns that seemed to tentatively emerge. But all of these patterns were also broken. And that's perhaps also a pattern, that there's a lot of inconsistencies where officials seem to have had a lot of power, discretionary power to apply laws or to and of course, I have a small sample, so I don't want to make big claims about, big generalizations. So everything I'm saying here about patterns has to be taken with a grain of salt. But the instabilities and breaks in the patterns that I saw in official lines of argumentation and official legal decision-making seem to point to significant elements or degrees of arbitrariness and unpredictability. And maybe this will not surprise those of you who've done have researched in this area much longer. But here are some of my patterns. So the first pattern is recognition as a victim, official recognition, Anerkennung, in the immediate post-war years versus 1950 and following. So for biracial descendants of the first Rhineland occupation, the process of obtaining official recognition as a victim of Nazi racial policy appears to have been somewhat easier in the immediate post-war years than it often was later on. Of 14 individuals who applied to local or district special aid committees, Sonderhilfsausschüsse, for victims of Nazism between 1946 and 1950, 11 obtained official recognition relatively quickly. Only 3 were turned down. And in the successful cases, the special aid committees typically acknowledged that the applicants for sterilization constituted a form of racial persecution. Some committees mentioned the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Only in a couple of cases did Sonderhilfsausschüsse reject applications, an applicant's application, arguing that the compulsory sterilization had occurred within the institutional and procedural parameters of the 1933 Sterilization Law, and thus could not be considered an instance of racial persecution. And what I saw is that in the later cases, officials were often much more hesitant and resistant to acknowledging that victims of the Rheinland-Bastarde sterilization campaign had been victims of an extra-legal measure of Nazi racial policy. There are actually three who initially get recognized as victims who lose their status again, who are in the 1950s or 1960s told that they're not meeting the conditions of paragraph 1 Bundesentschädigungsgesetz. So these individuals actually effectively lost again their recognition of their Nazi-era racial persecution after 1950. Then one would think that chances of obtaining reparations would rise and fall with the ability to prove that the forced sterilization had occurred outside the Sterilization Law of 1933. Many of you will know this. The hundreds of thousands of people who were forcefully sterilized under the 1933 law had very dim chances of reparations in the Federal Republic, because the Allies and also many Germans thought that that sterilization law really wasn't a criminal Nazi law. Now my group, the group biracial victims, since they had been sterilized outside that law, you would think that it's going to be easier for them to get reparations. But and to some extent, and so that would suggest their chances of obtaining reparations rise and fall with their ability to prove there was no hereditary health court decision. So they had been sterilized outside the law. And that is true in some of the cases. The one person in my sample who actually receives a pension, who receives back payments, who receives Kapitalentschädigung, so a pretty robust package of reparations after more than a decade of back and forth. He has a doctor who testifies, yes, I treated him at the time for a broken leg, for work-related accident, and I can attest that there was no Erbgesundheitsgerichts decision, and he was just whisked away by the Gestapo. So I think that is probably one crucial reason. And this is also an interesting case because the reparations officials accept that he has a psychological health problem that has a direct bearing on physical health problems, because as you also probably know, psychological problems, trauma did not count as something that would be compensated. And for most of my applicants, the decisive hurdle is that they have to show that their sterilization impacted them to such an extent, at least 25% or more, that they cannot perform work, that they cannot support themselves, function normally, that their ability to earn a living is reduced by at least 25%. And that's where most of my applicants stumble, where they cannot, where medical exams, because they only look at physical but not at psychological or mental health problems, consider them healthy enough to, go out and work and earn a living. So in this case where he can prove I didn't have an Erbgesundheitsgericht decision, he gets a very generous compensation. A couple of people cannot prove this, and this undermines their cases significantly. So this is a pattern. Officials could also be very narrow, because sometimes it was, a doctor would say, we can mit an Sicherheit grenzender Wahrscheinlichkeit this person was sterilized, but sometimes that wasn't enough for officials. And many hospitals claimed we don't have records of this, which isn't surprising, because this was a secret campaign to sterilize this group. So there wouldn't be necessarily the same kind of records about the surgery. However, in some cases, we have counterexamples, and here's where the pattern is broken. because in one case, for instance, or I have several cases where the official decision acknowledged that the applicant had been sterilized solely for racial reasons, but because it wasn't at least 25% Erwerbsminderung, that was still not enough. In one case, in fact, officials' explicit acknowledgement that a female applicant had been the victim of a racially motivated sterilization directly served to deny her compensation. In April of 1969, the State Reparations Office of the Saarland turned down Rosa B.'s application, arguing that she was the daughter of an Algerian French soldier. She had been forcefully sterilized in 1937. So yes, she met the definition of a racially persecuted person. However, precisely because she had been sterilized for racial reasons outside the 1933 Sterilization Law, she was not eligible, she was ineligible for a Härteausgleich according to paragraph 171 BEG SG. She eventually did get 5,000 marks in a Vergleich. But so what I'm finding is there are patterns, but they're always broken. There's always at least one or two cases where the pattern is broken. So I'll just offer some brief conclusions, and I can talk more if you're interested about some of the cases in discussion. What explains these breaks in the patterns or these inconsistencies? Is it, some of it is denial or ignorance of the specifics of the 1937 sterilization campaign, because that was a secret campaign and knowledge about it was uneven in German society. By the early 1960s, however, there are studies that mention it. For instance, the Psychologie der Verfolgten, one important study that has actually an interview with a biracial man who was forcefully sterilized, gives a very accurate account of the legal situation at the time. So this knowledge is there. This knowledge is also there in the late 40s when these committees recognize these people as victims of racial persecution. So there is knowledge, but it's uneven, and some of it is suppressed or just kind of fades. There's continuities in social and racial prejudices. One of the most consistent patterns, I'm out of time, but I'd say this, is that none of the people in my sample who were in Moringen, 2 men were in Moringen, 1 woman was in Uckermark and then Ravensbrück, 1 woman was in Hadamar. The woman in Hadamar gets a Härteausgleich of 1,500 marks in the 60s, but none of the others get anything, with the argument being that they're not persecuted, that they weren't persecuted racially. They were, you know, in juvenile correctional institutions, and there was a proper legal process for getting them into those, and so they're not being recognized. So that is a very pattern I see. There is also an interesting question about remembering and forgetting, because in one of the Moringen cases, in his application for restitution, in the early 1980s, one of the Sachbereiter in Wiesbaden, one of the people in the office that is reviewing the case, is including a chapter from Gansmüller, a book by Christian Gansmüller, Die Erbgesundheitspolitik des Dritten Reichs from 1987, telling his colleague, you know, here, you see, they did do this. They did sterilize these biracial young people. So a new discovery that a younger generation of officials is now making, that 20 years earlier, their colleagues knew about this but didn't want to talk about it. So there is an interesting shift.
Thank you very much.